Assalamu alaikum everyone. Hello grade 11. Today we're going to start reading comprehension and vocabulary skills since we've already done the grammar for this semester. So I would like you to go get your student book and a pen or pencil and come back quickly to read with me, please. Okay, so I guess you got your book. Now we can go to page 57, please. This is the first page in module 5. And the module talks about the written word. As you see in front of you on the screen, we have a picture of an author. An author is a writer. Notice, have you ever seen this person? Do you know who the author is? Do you know his books? Well, if you don't know, this is the very famous English writer called Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens lived, or was born actually, at the beginning of the 19th century. You probably know that that was the time of the Industrial Revolution, Thawra Sinaiya. You studied about it. And if you look to the side, in the second picture, you see some kind of paper that has dots and somebody trying to feel the dots with their fingers. This is a special kind of writing that we will be talking about afterwards in our next lesson, inshallah. Finally, you have the picture on the side as well, on the in the middle of the page, and you have the picture of Robinson Crusoe. I don't know if you've read this book, but it's a very, very famous book. Maybe you know it with a different name, because Robinson Crusoe, although it's a classic, sometimes it's adapted to movies or cartoons under different names. But you know the story of a man who was in a ship, and the ship was wrecked in a storm, and he ended up living on an island all alone. And the story tells us how he was able to survive and how he was able to build a house, plant some food for him to eat, and so on. This is the original story, and it's called Robinson Crusoe. So as you can see, our unit is going to be about the written word. When we talk about the written word, we usually think of writing, regular writing, and this is what we will tackle in our first lesson. So we will talk about this famous writer who is called Charles Dickens. Okay, so here we have, in front of us, we have Charles Dickens. And today's lesson is going to be about him and his life. So before we begin, what do you know about Charles Dickens? Charles Dickens is a very, very famous English writer. He lived, as I told you, in the 19th century. He came from a poor family, and this is an important piece of information. And he wrote during the Industrial Revolution, as I explained before. So let's read the words in the box and see which words refer to types of writers. The first word is journalist. So what is a journalist? A journalist is a person who writes in a journal. That's a journalist. So journalist is a type of writer. Novelist. A novelist is someone who writes novels. A novel is riwayah. Novelist is a person who writes a novel. Narrator. The narrator is not a writer. The narrator might be a character in the story, and the narrator is usually the person who tells the story. He or she is part of the characters of the story. Clerk. What is the meaning of clerk? A clerk is a person who works at an office doing daily tasks, answering the phone, doing the books, the accounts. Maybe he is sent on errands to go get stuff or send letters, bring papers. A clerk, that's a clerk. An author is a writer. An author is a type of writer. So up until now, we have journalist, we have novelist, and we have author. We also have the word lawyer. You know lawyers? Lawyers are people who defend people in court. They try to prove that they are guilty or innocent. And you've probably seen lots of lawyers in movies. A lawyer is not a type of writer. Playwright. Please pay attention to the way we write this word. Playwright. A playwright is a person who writes plays. A play is مسرحية. So a playwright is a person who writes plays or writes drama. Playwright is a type of writer. Last but not least is the poet. The poet is a person who writes poetry, الشعر, poetry. So a poet is also a type of writer. Let's move to the reading and start with Charles Dickens. So, Charles Dickens was born on the 7th of February, 1812 in Portsmouth on the southern coast of England. He was a quiet boy. Quiet boy means he wasn't very active or loud. What did he do? Who loved reading. He loved reading. Notice, what type of structure is this? Who loved reading? This is a clause that came after boy. Actually, this is an adjective clause that is modifying the word boy. Remember that. So, when he spoke later of his childhood, he said that he remembered listening to children playing outside as he sat indoors. So what is the meaning of childhood? It's the time when you are a child. And what does he remember about his childhood? He remembers that he used to listen to the children playing outside. He wasn't with them. He didn't go outside to play because he was a quiet boy. But he stayed indoors. Indoors means he stayed at home. He always preferred reading to playing with other children. So this explains why he didn't go outside, because he preferred or he liked to read more than to play with other children. At the age of 12, life for his family changed very suddenly. His father had financial problems, so Charles was no longer able to attend school regularly and he had to work at a factory. I'm going to link this idea to the times in which Charles Dickens lived. I told you, he lived during the times of the Industrial Revolution, الثورة الصناعية. And you remember, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of factories were opened. And a lot of the times, the owners of the factories actually wanted people to work for very little money. So they used children and women, usually in factories and in mines, and they gave them, or they paid them very little money. So when Charles's father had financial problems, financial means money problems, Charles was not able to go to school and he had to work to get money to help his family. The loneliness he felt there meaning in the factory, he felt very lonely. And the loneliness he felt there was an important influence on his writing. Because he went through this experience when he was a child, he was only 12 years old. So he was very, very young. And he had to work in a factory and he was very lonely. And this feeling of being lonely influenced. What is the meaning of influenced? It means it had an impact on his writing, especially in his books, Great Expectations and David Copperfield. Notice how these two expressions are written. They are written in italics. That's because they are titles of books. Great Expectations is one very important book by Charles Dickens. And also another book is called David Copperfield. We will talk about a third book, a very nice book, when we finish this lesson. So, when he was 14, Charles stopped going to school altogether. So, when he was 12, he left school, but he used to go some days and some days not. But after 14, he stopped going totally, and he started working as a clerk in a lawyer's office in London. So a clerk, as I told you before, is a person who runs errands, does the daily chores in an office. He didn't like working there. He did not enjoy being a clerk. Luckily, what is the meaning of luckily? Luckily here is like out of mere luck, or fortunately. Luckily is an adverb. So it comes at the beginning of a sentence and it's followed by a comma. Luckily, things changed for him again. So there was change in his life, and probably because it starts with luckily, then this is a good change. Charles had always wanted to be a writer, of course, because he read a lot, he loved reading, so probably he wanted to be a writer, and he became a very respected journalist. So how did Charles Dickens begin? He began by becoming a journalist, writing in a journal. He began to write short pieces for publication in the newspaper. Short pieces means small, short pieces of writing that are published in a newspaper. In 1836, a series of pieces called the Pickwick Papers appeared monthly in the newspaper and were very popular. Dickens was a famous author by then. So Dickens became famous because of the Pickwick Papers. That were the Pickwick Papers is actually now we can buy it as one whole novel, but it was actually published as a series of pieces. It wasn't published in one volume. It was published monthly or weekly. I'm sorry, here it says appeared monthly. So it's a monthly newspaper that published parts of the story every month. Throughout his life, Dickens enjoyed traveling. He traveled to many countries, writing novels and giving talks about the cruelty of slavery. So we can consider Charles Dickens to be one of the first people to call for human rights. In his stories, he talked about how children and women and criminals were treated badly by society. He even talked about slavery. Slavery means when somebody is bought and sold and made to work without being paid. So, novels such as Oliver Twist and Dombey and Son highlighted the cruel treatment of people, especially children, and child labor in the 19th century. Of course, Dickens' stories reflected his experience. When he talked about small children in his books, he talked about poor children who were treated badly by society. And this is reflected in almost all of his books. Child labor means the work of children. He died on the 8th of June, 1870, at the age of 58. So now we're done with the lesson for Charles Dickens. And I want you to go with me to page 60 on your books. Page 60 has a vocabulary section that talks about types of books. After we talk about these different types of books, we're going to read about a story written by Charles Dickens, a very interesting story. So before we do the story, let's look at this exercise. On the top of the page, you see the covers of 3 books. One book is called All About Volcanoes. The other one is called Dombey and Son. And the one on the side is called a poetry book. Let's look at this vocabulary section. And it says, vocabulary types of books. Complete the book description with the words in the box. Let's read these words in the box and try to understand them. What is the meaning of short story? Short story, it explains itself. قصص قصيرة. It's a story that is short. What is a biography? A biography is a book that tells us about the life of a person. Biography is a book about the life, the childhood, and the life of a person. So it's something like Sira. Now, if somebody writes his own biography, then it's called an autobiography. An autobiography is Sira Dhatiya. But biography means a book that is about the life of a person. Novel, we explained before. A novel is a very long story. Poetry is language that is musical. Play is a kind of writing that talks about characters who perform on stage. And the meaning of nonfiction is a kind of writing that doesn't talk about stories or plays. It talks about things that are not fictional. That means things that are factual, like your science book, your chemistry book, your physics book, your geography book, the stories we hear on the news. These are non-fiction. So they are not made up by a writer, but they are real stories that happened. These are non-fiction. Okay. So let's fill in the blanks with these words in the box. Notice, Julius Caesar. Notice it's written in italics, so it's a title of a work. I don't know if you've heard of it, but this is a very, very famous play by Shakespeare. So Julius Caesar is a play by Shakespeare. Dombey and Son, we just mentioned it in the reading. Dombey and Son, what is it? It's a novel by Charles Dickens. Number 3, A Child's Garden of Verses. Verse means poetry. So from the title, I can guess that it is a poetry anthology. Notice the meaning of the word anthology. I apologize. An anthology is a collection of stories or a collection of poems in one book. Number 4, 1001 Nights. Again, it's written in italics. And it is a group of short stories told by a helpless woman to keep herself alive. I know that you know this, but maybe under a different name. هي ألف ليلة وليلة. And the helpless woman is Shahrazad, if you know the story. Okay, number 5, Shakespeare's Life by J. Maxwell is a biography of this famous playwright. Playwright, who is the playwright? Shakespeare. He wrote plays. And J. Maxwell wrote about Shakespeare's life. So this is a biography. Number 6, All About Volcanoes. Probably this is a factual book. This book gives us information. It is not a story. It's not imaginative. It's real facts. It is an informative, non-fiction book. So now we know the different types of stories and, the different types of writing, short stories, novels, poetry, play, and biography. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to keep this short and I'm going to stop here with the lesson about Charles Dickens and the exercise for the vocabulary. Just a reminder, in this lesson, we learned about a famous author. Who is that famous author? Charles Dickens. And we also learned about different kinds of writing, like novels, plays, short stories, poetry, etc. We also learned about different names for writers, because whatever a writer writes makes him a different kind of writer. So we have novelists who write novels, poets who write poetry, a playwright or playwrights who write plays, journalists who write articles in newspapers and journals. I want you to please do your homework in your activity book or workbook. If you can go with me to the activity book, Unit 7, page 40. On page 40, you have exercise 1, which is the vocabulary. Fill in the blanks with one of the words. And then you have page 41, exercise 5, that tells you to complete the following paragraph with the types of books from the box. Next time, in our next lesson, we will start by answering these two questions, number 1 and number 5. And we will talk about one story that was written by Charles Dickens, a very famous story, and then move on. So I'm just going to write for you the number of the page and the number. So it's page 40, exercise 1, and page 41, exercise 5. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me and I'll be ready to answer you. See you soon, inshallah. Hope you enjoyed it.